It started in a quiet, upper-class neighborhood where every lawn was trimmed the same way, and every house looked like it came from the same catalog. A place where the smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with the faint sound of sprinklers in the morning, and where people waved politely without ever really knowing each other. It was the kind of community that prided itself on being perfect, spotless streets, manicured hedges, and rules for everything. Even the color of your mailbox had to be approved by the Homeowners Association. On paper, it was safe, peaceful, and ideal. But beneath that perfection, there was a rot that no one wanted to see. The story began with a man named Ray Donovan, a quiet, middle-aged homeowner who had lived in Brookside Estates for 5 years. He wasn't the type to stir trouble. He kept to himself, paid his dues, and minded his own business. Most neighbors didn't know that before he bought that beige 2-story house with the white shutters. Ray had spent 20 years in the military, 10 of them in Delta Force. He'd seen war zones that most people only heard about in the news. But here in this shiny, picture-perfect suburb, he thought he'd finally found peace. Every morning, Ray followed the same routine. Coffee at 6 a.m., jog around the block, then breakfast on the porch while his old dog, Ranger, lay at his feet. The world outside seemed calm. Retired couples tended their flower beds. Families waved from driveways. Kids rode their bikes in circles on the cul-de-sac. It was all so ordinary, so safe that you wouldn't believe what was about to happen in a place like this. The first signs of tension were small, too small for anyone else to notice. A letter slipped under Ray's door. "Your lawn height exceeds HOA regulations," it read. He chuckled and ignored it. A week later, another note appeared, this time taped to his garage. "Failure to comply will result in fines." He trimmed the grass, even though it didn't look any different from anyone else. But that didn't stop the letters. They kept coming about his trash can being out too long, about a small flag he'd hung by his porch, about a light that stayed on after 10 p.m. Ray tried to reason with them. He sent polite emails. He even attended an HOA meeting once. That's when he met them, the people who thought they ran the neighborhood like it was their personal kingdom. The president, Mark Hensley, was a man who wore expensive watches and always talked like he was in charge of something important. He smiled too much, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Sitting beside him were 2 other members, Karen Shaw, who acted like she owned every front yard on the block, and Brian Kessler, a younger guy who handled the security committee. They talked about order, standards, and community values. But all Ray heard was control. Something about the way they spoke made his skin crawl. It wasn't what they said, it was how they said it. Like they enjoyed the power, like they got a thrill from telling others what they could or couldn't do. For a while, Ray brushed it off. He'd been through worse. He figured it was just neighborhood politics, but then the letters turned into threats. "Failure to correct violations will result in enforcement action. You are being watched." One night, he caught someone standing near his mailbox, flashlight in hand. The man turned and walked away before Ray could say a word. The next morning, his mailbox was gone. Just gone. In its place, a hole in the ground and a note that said, "Non-compliant fixtures removed by HOA security." That was when Ray stopped laughing. He began to notice strange things after that. Cars parked too long near his driveway, people walking their dogs who didn't seem to have dogs at all, and men wearing dark uniforms that had no official badge, just a patch that said community safety. They looked like cops at first glance, but something was off. The uniforms didn't match. The vehicles had no plates, and the way they stared at him wasn't how real officers did. The neighbors didn't ask questions. Some even whispered that Ray was causing problems. The HOA meetings became more hostile. When Ray showed up to ask about the fake officers, Mark brushed him off, saying, "It's just our new neighborhood patrol, nothing to worry about." But Ray knew what intimidation looked like. He'd seen it in war zones, men who used fear to control others. This was no different. Behind all their polite smiles and community rules, there was something darker, a hunger for control. The HOA wasn't just enforcing guidelines. They were running a small empire built on fear and fines, and Ray was now their target. What they didn't know was that the man they were trying to intimidate had once dismantled enemy networks twice their size. He wasn't a man who scared easily. He'd buried friends, faced ambushes, and survived the kind of nights that changed a person forever. Compared to that, a few fake cops and smug board members were nothing. Still, Ray tried to handle it peacefully. He called the real police, filed reports, and even reached out to the city office. But the system was slow, tangled in red tape, and the HOA knew it. They acted untouchable, walking around like they were law enforcement themselves. The breaking point came one humid evening in July. Ray was fixing his front gate when he heard engines outside, two black SUVs rolling up the street. The vehicles stopped right in front of his house. 4 men stepped out, wearing tactical vests marked HOA Security Enforcement. They had radios, flashlights, and the swagger of men who thought a uniform made them powerful. Something in Ray's chest went cold. He'd seen this kind of setup before: intimidation, force, dominance. But this was his home, his street, and he wasn't about to be bullied. The neighbors peeked from their windows, watching silently. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. In that moment, the perfect little world of Brookside Estates didn't feel safe anymore. It felt like a trap, a beautiful cage with guards at the gate. And as those fake cops approached his driveway, Ray realized the peace he'd been trying to protect was already gone. The war he thought he'd left behind had just found him again. Only this time, it was wearing a smile, holding a clipboard, and calling itself the HOA. The weeks after the fake HOA security visit changed everything in Brookside Estates. The calm, predictable rhythm of life there, morning jogs, trimmed lawns, friendly waves, started to feel staged, like everyone was acting out a lie. For Ray, every sound now carried weight. The hum of a car idling too long, the glint of a phone camera behind a curtain. Even the mail felt threatening, filled with warnings and fines that no one else seemed to get. He started noticing how the neighbors looked at him differently. The couple across the street who used to wave stopped making eye contact. Kids who once petted his dog now crossed to the other side of the road. It wasn't just paranoia. Someone was spreading rumors that Ray was aggressive, that he'd threatened HOA staff, that he was unstable. The more he tried to clear his name, the guiltier he seemed. It was a slow, quiet kind of war, psychological, isolating, and calculated. Ray didn't know it yet, but behind those rumors was Mark Hensley. The HOA president had a way of twisting the truth until it worked in his favor. He saw Ray as a threat, not just to his control, but to the image of power he had built in that neighborhood. Mark liked being feared. He liked how people paused when he spoke. To him, Ray's resistance was an insult, and he wasn't about to let one man ruin what he called the order of the community. At the next HOA meeting, things boiled over. Ray showed up calm, collected, holding a small folder, printed copies of every threatening letter, photos of the fake officers, even a video of the SUVs parked outside his house. When he laid the evidence on the table, the room fell silent. "I just want to know who authorized this," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air. Mark leaned back, gave that cold smile he always wore. "You're misunderstanding, Ray. Those men were hired for community patrol, standard safety procedure." "They had no badges," Ray replied. "No identification, no license plates. You're impersonating law enforcement." A few homeowners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Mark didn't blink. "If you feel unsafe, you're welcome to move. We maintain high standards here." That was it. No accountability, no concern, just a quiet threat. The room stayed frozen until Ray stood, collected his papers, and walked out. Nobody said a word. But that night, 3 cars drove slowly past his house again, the same black SUVs. No plates, no lights. The message was clear: back off. From that point, Ray began keeping a journal, documenting every strange thing that happened. He installed cameras around his house, hidden and wired directly to his phone. He'd been trained to notice patterns, and the pattern was obvious. Every time he resisted, the HOA pushed harder. The harassment got bolder. Someone slashed his tires. Then a week later, his electricity was cut off for maintenance. A city worker came by, confused, saying no such order had ever been made. Ray knew exactly who was behind it. Meanwhile, Mark's mask started to slip. Behind closed doors, he was growing obsessed with maintaining control. His position as HOA president wasn't just a title, it was his identity. Before moving to Brookside, he'd lost everything: his job, his marriage, his reputation, after being caught in a real estate fraud scandal. The HOA was his second chance, a place where he could rebuild his image and feel powerful again. But Ray's defiance reminded him of his past failures, the humiliation he'd sworn to bury. Karen Shaw, the vice president, had her own reasons for siding with Mark. Her husband had left her 2 years earlier, and she filled the emptiness by inserting herself into everyone else's business. Controlling the neighborhood made her feel important. And Brian, the security head, was just a follower, an ex-volunteer deputy who had been kicked off the local auxiliary force for misuse of authority. Mark gave him the validation he craved, a fake badge and a sense of power. Together, they formed a small but dangerous circle, people who fed off control, hiding behind the facade of community rules. One evening, Ray caught Brian on his property. The man was standing near Ray's back gate, shining a flashlight through the fence. When confronted, he claimed he was checking for violations. Ray's patience snapped. He told Brian to get off his land before things got ugly. Brian left, but not before muttering, "You don't belong here, soldier boy." The next day, Ray got a violation notice for aggressive behavior toward HOA staff. It was all part of their plan to provoke him, record his reactions, and paint him as unstable. But Ray wasn't breaking. He'd been trained for worse psychological pressure. Instead, he dug deeper. He started researching HOA laws, local ordinances, and property rights. He documented everything, prepared complaints, and even reached out to an investigative journalist he knew from his military days. The man agreed to look into it. That's when things turned dangerous. The HOA board discovered the investigation. Someone had hacked into Ray's Wi-Fi, his emails, files, everything. They found out he was collecting evidence. A few nights later, his cameras caught two men trespassing on his property, one of them clearly being Brian. They weren't there to intimidate anymore. They were looking for something, or maybe to destroy it. Ray stayed quiet, hidden in the dark, watching through a thermal scope he still kept from his service days. His pulse stayed steady. He waited until they reached his shed, then flipped on the floodlights and stepped outside. They froze. "You boys lost?" Ray asked, his voice cold. Brian stammered something about routine checks, but Ray didn't move. He stared them down until they backed off, climbed into their SUV, and sped away. He didn't chase them. He didn't need to. The message had been sent and received. But even then, Ray didn't realize how far they were willing to go. Mark, furious that Ray had embarrassed them yet again, decided to take it up a notch. He called for a special security operation, a night patrol to monitor non-compliant homeowners. It was a cover. Their real goal was to confront Ray directly, scare him enough to make him leave. Mark convinced a few HOA loyalists to play along, promising it was all legal and necessary. At the same time, external pressure was closing in. The HOA's finances were a mess, embezzlement hidden behind fake maintenance costs. Ray's complaint to the county inspector was getting attention, and Mark knew that if any investigator showed up, they'd uncover everything. He needed Ray gone before that happened. Meanwhile, Ray's internal struggle was starting to show. He couldn't sleep. Every noise outside jolted him awake. The sense of peace he'd fought for was gone, replaced by a constant readiness, like being back in a war zone. The nightmares returned, faces of men he couldn't save, missions that went wrong. Ranger, his old dog, sensed it too. The house no longer felt like home. But through it all, Ray refused to break. He kept reminding himself, "Don't start the fight. Finish it if you have to." The tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point when a group of HOA members showed up unannounced one Saturday morning, cameras in hand, filming Ray's property. They accused him of unauthorized modifications, a violation that didn't exist. When he told them to leave, one of them shouted, "We'll get the cops." Ray laughed bitterly. "You mean you're fake ones?" The laughter hit a nerve. Mark's face turned red. He stormed forward, shouting about community authority and noncompliance, but Ray didn't flinch. The two men stood face to face, one a soldier who'd seen real combat, the other a man pretending to be powerful. The difference between them was painful to watch. After that confrontation, the neighborhood split. Some started questioning the HOA, others grew terrified, siding with Mark out of fear. The place that once felt like a community now felt like a cold battlefield. Ray knew something was coming. He felt it in his bones, that heavy stillness before a storm. The way they looked at him, the sudden quiet, the way even the mail stopped coming. It was all too familiar. A few nights later, he heard it again, the low rumble of engines outside. 2 SUVs, then another. They parked the same way as before, lights off, engines running. Only this time, the men who got out weren't just there to scare him. They moved like they had a plan. Inside, Ray loaded his phone camera, recording everything. He whispered to Ranger, who was growling low, every muscle tense. He could see their silhouettes through the blinds, helmets, vests, flashlights. They were coming closer. And in that moment, everything that had been boiling under the surface, the fear, the anger, the injustice, reached its limit. The war that began with letters and petty fines was about to explode into something far more dangerous. The men outside didn't realize it yet, but the man they were trying to break was the wrong kind of man to push that far. The neighborhood had no idea what was about to happen, but by the time the night was over, Brookside Estates would never look the same again. The night it all came crashing down was thick with heat, the kind that clung to your skin and made the air feel heavy, almost electric. The street was unusually quiet for Brookside Estates. No porch lights, no barking dogs, no laughter spilling from backyards. It was as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. Ray sat in his living room, the blinds slightly open. His cameras had picked up movement again, 3 SUVs circling the block, their headlights off. He could hear the faint hum of engines outside, low and steady. Ranger growled softly at the window, ears perked. Ray reached down, running his hand over the dog's head, calm but ready. He'd called the county sheriff earlier that evening, reporting suspicious activity. The dispatcher said they'd send a unit when available. That had been over an hour ago. No one came, and deep down, Ray knew why. Someone had made sure they wouldn't. At 11:42 p.m., the first SUV stopped, then another, then a third. 6 men stepped out. They wore black tactical vests, flashlights, and earpieces. No badges, no names, just the same stitched patch on their shoulders. Brookside HOA Security Division. Ray watched through the cameras as they spread out across his yard, moving with rehearsed precision. They weren't just bluffing this time. Someone had given them orders. Someone had planned this. He heard the soft crunch of gravel as 2 of them crept toward the back gate. Another pair moved toward the front door, one carrying what looked like a clipboard, the prop they always used to make it seem official. But this time, one of them also had a holstered pistol. That was new. Ray's chest tightened, but his mind stayed clear. He'd been in worse situations, ambushes in dark alleys, missions gone sideways. Fear was useless now. Preparation was everything. He turned off every light in the house except for one small lamp near the window, angled just enough to silhouette his shadow on the wall. Then he moved quietly into the hallway, staying out of sight, his phone recording everything. Outside, the men started talking in low tones. One of them, Brian, was giving orders. Front team, entry check. Rear team, cover the exits, make it fast. Ray almost smiled. They thought this was going to be easy. He heard the first knock, loud and deliberate. "Mr. Donovan," a voice called. It was Mark. "We need to discuss your continued non-compliance with community regulations." The tone was smug, dripping with mock authority. Ray didn't answer. Another knock, harder this time. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Mark said. "Open the door or we'll have to proceed with enforcement." Ray's recording caught every word. Then came the sound of boots against wood, someone testing the strength of the door. Ranger barked sharply, breaking the silence. "Control your animal," Brian shouted from outside. Ray moved to the side of the door, hand on the knob, waiting. He could hear his own heartbeat now, slow and steady. Every second stretched out like a lifetime. Then the sound of a lock pick, metal scratching against metal. They were breaking in. That was it. The line had been crossed. Ray took a deep breath, the calm of a man who'd been here before, at the edge between fear and instinct. The door burst open. The first man stepped inside, flashlight cutting through the dark. "Clear left," he said. Ray moved faster than they expected. In one motion, he grabbed the man's wrist, twisted hard, and shoved him backward into the entryway. The flashlight clattered to the floor, its beam rolling wildly across the walls. "Stand down," Brian shouted, pulling his weapon. But before he could aim, Ray had already ducked behind the wall. The next second he flipped the breaker, the house went pitch black. Chaos, shouts, footsteps. Someone tripped over a chair, someone else yelled, "He's armed," even though Ray was. Ray stayed low, moving through the dark like it was second nature. The years of training came back in flashes, silent footwork, controlled breathing, use of light and shadow. He could hear where they were, sense their confusion. Then a gun went off, one deafening shot. The sound shook the small house, a lamp shattered. Ranger barked wildly, then went silent. "Stop firing," Mark screamed. "Do you want to kill someone?" But the panic was already spreading. These men weren't soldiers, they were pretenders. Fear made them sloppy. One of them crashed into a table. Another yelled for backup, even though there was no one else coming. Ray found Brian near the kitchen, flashlight trembling in his hand. "Put it down," Ray said quietly from the shadows. Brian spun toward the voice. You assaulted an officer." "You're not an officer," Ray said. "You're a thug in a rented vest." He stepped out of the dark, close enough for Brian to see his face. The younger man froze, caught between fear and shame. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered. "He said we were just supposed to scare you." "Who said that?" Brian hesitated. "Mark." The name hung in the air like a curse. Before Ray could say another word, Mark appeared in the doorway, red-faced, shaking with rage. "You think you can threaten me in my own neighborhood?" he shouted. He raised the pistol. His hand trembled, but his voice was full of arrogance. Ray's instincts kicked in. "Don't," he said firmly. "You're not in control here." But Mark didn't listen. He crossed a line long before this night, the line between leadership and delusion. His empire was collapsing, and in his mind, Ray was the reason. His finger tightened on the trigger. Ray dove sideways as the gun went off again, the shot splintering wood beside his head. He tackled Mark to the ground, the gun skidding across the floor. They struggled, not like trained fighters, but like men who'd both lost too much. "Call it off, Mark," Ray shouted, pinning him down. Mark spat, "You don't belong here." In the chaos, Brian grabbed the gun. He looked at them both, breathing hard, sweat pouring down his face. "Stop it, just stop." But Mark, still twisted under Ray, screamed, "Do it. Do what I told you." Brian's hands shook. His eyes darted between them, the man he followed and the man he feared. And then, with one trembling movement, he dropped the gun and ran out the door. The house fell silent except for the sound of heavy breathing. Ray stood slowly, keeping his distance. Mark lay on the floor, staring up at the ceiling, chest heaving, face pale. "Do you even hear yourself?" Ray said quietly. "You ruined people's lives over a lawn, a mailbox, a set of rules no one cares about." Mark didn't respond. His ego, his authority, all of it was shattered. Then suddenly flashing lights appeared outside. Real police this time. Sirens cutting through the night. Someone must have finally called them, maybe a neighbor, maybe Brian. Ray stepped out onto the porch, hands raised, calm as ever. The officers rushed forward, weapons drawn. "Drop your weapon," one yelled. "I don't have one," Ray said, steady voice, eyes tired. "They broke into my home." Behind him, Mark stumbled out of the house, yelling incoherently. "He attacked us. He's dangerous. Arrest him." But it was over. The cameras had caught everything, the break-in, the fake uniforms, the gunfire. The truth was all there, laid bare. Mark's words fell apart in the chaos. The officers pushed him to the ground, cuffed him, and read him his rights. His voice cracked as he shouted, "You don't understand, I was protecting the neighborhood." Ray watched, silent, as the man who tried to play God in a suburban empire was taken away under real authority. The adrenaline drained from his body all at once. His hands trembled slightly, his breathing uneven. He glanced back at the house, the broken door, the shattered lamp, the silence that hung heavy after the storm. Ranger limped out from behind the couch, tail wagging weakly. Ray knelt, whispering, holding the old dog close. Outside, the neighborhood started to stir. Curtains moved, doors cracked open, neighbors stepping out into the night to witness what their silence had allowed to grow. Ray didn't say a word to them. He just stood there, sweat and dust on his face, watching the flashing red and blue lights reflect off the perfect white fences and manicured lawns. All that control, all that order, it had finally turned on itself. And as the cruisers pulled away, taking Mark and his men into custody, the illusion of peace in Brookside Estates was gone forever. The days that followed were strangely quiet. The street that had once been so proud of its calm, perfect order now looked like a scene from a storm, the kind that doesn't leave broken trees or power lines, but something deeper, heavier, the kind that shakes people from the inside out. Brookside Estates was no longer the same. News vans lined the sidewalks for 2 straight days after the arrests. Reporters stood on manicured lawns, talking into microphones about the HOA scandal in suburban paradise. Words like vigilantism, impersonation, and armed intimidation filled every headline. Neighbors who once smiled for photos with Mark now avoided cameras, closing their blinds and pretending they know nothing. Ray watched it all from inside his home. The door was fixed, the windows replaced, but the air still carried the weight of what happened. The house didn't feel safe anymore, not because of what might come next, but because of what had already happened. He'd spent hours talking to detectives, replaying every detail for them. The officers had watched his footage, the SUVs, the men breaking in, the gunfire. It was all there, time-stamped and clear. They told him he'd done nothing wrong, that his self-defense was justified. but that didn't bring him peace. The investigation tore through the HOA like wildfire. Within a week, all three main members, Mark, Karen, and Brian, were charged. Mark faced the heaviest charges: aggravated assault, impersonation of law enforcement, conspiracy, and unlawful possession of a firearm. Karen was charged with aiding and abetting, and Brian, after coming forward to cooperate, was offered a plea deal. The revelation hit the community like a punch to the gut. The HOA's finances were audited, uncovering years of fraud, fake maintenance expenses, misused funds, and secret security contracts that led to the fake officers. The empire Mark built on control and intimidation crumbled overnight. Some neighbors tried to defend him, saying he had only been trying to protect the community. But most just wanted distance. The same people who'd once obeyed every HOA rule now cursed the name they'd once feared. They talked about how it went too far, as if they hadn't been part of the silence that allowed it all to happen. Karen broke first. During questioning, she broke down in tears, saying she never meant for anyone to get hurt. She claimed she'd been manipulated, that Mark had convinced her it was all legal, all for the good of the neighborhood. But when the prosecutors showed her the documents she'd signed, her voice went quiet. Guilt consumed her. She stopped showing up to hearings, her house went dark, and within a month, a for sale sign stood in her yard. Brian disappeared for a while. Rumor said he'd moved in with family out of state after testifying against Mark. His statement revealed everything: the intimidation tactics, the staged patrols, the plan to scare Ray into selling his property. He confessed that he'd joined because it made him feel like someone again after years of being dismissed and powerless. The shame followed him everywhere. And then there was Mark. When the trial began, he walked into the courtroom still wearing the same polished arrogance he'd always carried, as if the world still owed him respect. He spoke about how he'd kept the community safe and maintained order where the system failed. He called the fake patrols a misunderstanding, insisting he'd only done what real law enforcement was too lazy to do. But the evidence crushed him. The footage from Ray's cameras played for the jury, the threats, the break-in, the gunfire. The illusion of leadership was shattered, leaving only a man obsessed with control, stripped of the power that had defined his life. When the verdict was read, guilty on all major counts, Mark didn't look at anyone. He didn't speak, didn't plead. The arrogance was gone. What remained was emptiness, like a man staring into the space where his empire used to be. For Ray, the end of the trial didn't feel like a victory. It felt like release, a quiet exhale after months of holding his breath. But the peace he'd wanted never fully returned. He stayed in the house, but it wasn't home anymore. The nights were still restless. Every sound outside made him tense. The war he'd thought he'd left behind had found its way back, only this time it wore a neighbor's face. The county sheriff came by once off duty to shake his hand. "You handled yourself better than most would have," he said. "You saved more people than you realize." Ray thanked him, but the words didn't stick. He hadn't set out to be a hero. He just wanted to live quietly in peace. Yet even in peace, he'd learned some people can't stand not being in control, people who hide behind titles, committees, and fake authority just to feel powerful. The HOA was disbanded by court order. A management company took over, enforcing only basic maintenance rules. No one argued anymore. The neighborhood, once so obsessed with control, had learned to fear it instead. Still, guilt lingered in the air, not Ray's guilt, but collective guilt. The guilt of neighbors who saw things and said nothing. The guilt of people who had nodded along with Mark because it was easier than standing up to him. They avoided Ray now, not out of anger, but out of shame. He'd become a reminder of everything they'd ignored. Late one evening, Ray stood on his porch, the same spot where it all began. The sky was turning orange, the cicadas humming in the trees. Ranger lay by his feet, older now, slower, but still loyal as ever. Across the street, a "For Rent" sign flapped in the wind where Mark's house once stood, empty, silent, forgotten. A delivery driver passed by and gave a small wave. Ray nodded back. It was the first normal human moment he'd had in months. As he looked down the street, the same one that had once been lined with perfect smiles and hidden malice, he realized something. Perfection had always been a lie. Beneath every manicured lawn and shiny car, there had always been fear, competition, and pride. The HOA had only made it visible. When the news crews left, when the gossip faded, the quiet returned. But it was a different kind of quiet now, honest, fragile, and real. Ray finally sat down, sipping from his mug, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. He thought about the people who'd tried to play gods in their little world and how quickly it had all fallen apart. For years, he'd believed war existed only in faraway places, deserts, cities torn by conflict, fields soaked in dust and blood. But now he understood war could live anywhere, even behind a white picket fence. And sometimes, all it took to end it was for someone to stop pretending and finally stand their ground. Months passed, and the once perfect neighborhood of Brookhaven Ridge faded from headlines. The cameras were gone, the gossip quieted, and life began its slow crawl back to normalcy, though normal no longer meant what it used to. The story of the HOA that turned on its own had left a stain that no coat of paint or new landscaping could cover. Mark Jefferson, the self-proclaimed protector of order, was sentenced to 15 years in state prison without parole for aggravated assault, impersonation of law enforcement, and fraud. The judge called his actions an egregious abuse of power hidden beneath suburban civility. His mugshot circulated online, and for a man who'd once prided himself on image and control, the humiliation was worse than the sentence. Behind bars, Mark remained defiant. He told reporters he'd been misunderstood, that he'd only done what was necessary to keep the neighborhood from falling apart. But as time passed, his arrogance fractured. The few who visited him, lawyers, journalists, a handful of loyal ex-members, described him as quieter, slower, almost hollow. The man who'd once orchestrated fear now lived under someone else's rules. Karen, who had once been the polished face of the HOA, pled guilty to aiding and abetting. Her plea deal spared her from jail time, but not from consequences. She lost her job, her house, and eventually her marriage. She moved to another town, changing her name and trying to rebuild. But every time a neighbor smiled too long or asked too many questions, she felt the same chill, as if control could slip away again. Brian, the hesitant accomplice turned whistleblower, found no peace either. Despite his cooperation, he couldn't escape the stigma. His name became synonymous with betrayal to some, for enabling Mark in the first place, and to others for exposing him. He lived quietly, consumed by guilt and a question that haunted him. If he'd spoken up earlier, would any of it have gone this far? And then there was Ray. In the months after the verdict, Ray received letters from reporters, from other homeowners across the country, even from strangers. Some called him a hero, a symbol of resistance against small-scale tyranny. Others accused him of escalating the situation, saying he should have let the HOA handle it differently. But Ray had long stopped caring what others thought. He still lived in the same house, though it didn't quite feel like home. The bullet holes in the wall had been patched, but in quiet moments he could still see them. Some nights he'd wake up sweating, hearing the echo of boots on gravel, the command to open the door. Therapy helped slowly, painfully. He talked about the war, the neighborhood, and the moment he realized the two weren't so different. Both had rules. Both had people who believed power justified anything. And in both, the ones who claimed to protect order often caused the most harm. One afternoon, a local journalist came to interview him for a follow-up piece. She asked what he thought about justice, whether he believed it had been served. Ray thought for a long time before answering. "Justice," he said. "I don't know if you can call it that. Mark's in prison. The HOA's gone, but that doesn't fix what people let happen. Justice isn't about punishment. It's about understanding what made it possible in the first place." The journalist nodded but didn't respond. There wasn't much to add. In the months that followed, counties across the state quietly began reviewing homeowners association laws. Legislators debated oversight measures, transparency requirements, and limits on HOA authority. A new state law, unofficially dubbed Ray's Law, made it illegal for any HOA to hire private enforcement or conduct pseudo-police operations without proper credentials and oversight. News outlets used Brookhaven Ridge as a case study, how ordinary power, left unchecked, can curdle into control and fear. Academics called it a modern parable of suburban authority, where the desire for perfection hides moral decay. For the neighbors still living there, life never fully returned to the easy comfort of before. They mowed their lawns, waved politely, and kept their heads down. But something had changed, not just the HOA's absence, but the unspoken awareness of how fragile their civility really was. They'd all believed they were safe because they lived in a good neighborhood. After all, rules kept chaos out. What they hadn't realized was that the rules themselves had become the chaos. At its heart, the Brookhaven Ridge case wasn't just about crime. It was about control, fear, and the fine line between order and oppression. Mark's obsession with perfection masked a deep insecurity, a need to dominate his surroundings to silence the disorder inside himself. Corinne's compliance came from fear of losing status, while Brian's silence came from weakness, the same weakness that festers in many who see wrongs and say nothing. And the community, they were complicit too. They wanted peace so badly they ignored what it cost. They traded freedom for the illusion of security until the illusion shattered. In the end, every person in Brookhaven Ridge faced their reflection, some through trials, others through quiet shame, but none walked away untouched. Ray often sat on his porch at sunset, watching the world turn gold. The street was quieter now, but the silence felt earned, not enforced. He no longer looked for threats in every shadow. He just breathed, one evening at a time. He stopped thinking of himself as a soldier or a victim. He was just a man who'd seen what happens when people mistake authority for virtue, when they let rules replace empathy. Justice, he realized, isn't about who wins or loses. It's about what survives afterward. And what survived in Brookhaven Ridge wasn't perfection, or order, or fear. It was true. Raw, painful, and unpolished, but real. In the end, the community learned what Mark never could. True peace doesn't come from control. It comes from letting go.